Great, thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me to take part. I'm really delighted to be here, honoured to be here as well. In my contribution to this event, I want to address the theme of people, past and place by considering contemporary genetic accounts of the early Irish past. I think that these accounts are being produced by, they're framed by ideas of new techniques of genetic investigation, but I think they can also be thought about in relation to the tradition of historical geography, closely aligned with anthropology and archaeology, that explore the early history of the island in terms of patterns of settlement and the regional material legacies of those patterns in the landscape, traditions and the bodies of people. And I think geographers' own reflexive engagement with its own disciplinary history, that has a tradition of historical geography, gives us a good position to actually reflect on new discourses of the early past. I want to do so in ways also to reflect the strand of historical geography today concerned with the production of the past and the present and its implications for the configuration of collective identity and belonging in the nation-state, especially in this case in relation to long-standing questions of who is native and newcomer in competing scholarly and popular historic and prehistoric geographies of isolation, interconnection and origins in a society shaped by new patterns of migration. I want to consider how the ancient Irish past and the island's population are being explored genetically. That is, how they are being addressed in the science of studying human genetic variation in Ireland, in the popular presentation of this research, and in the popular culture of genetic tests for exploring Irish genealogical connections and ancient origins. But I also like to argue more widely for the need and the value of a critical geographical engagement with human population genetics that considers the versions of historical geographies of settlement, migration, isolation, and interaction of people over space at different scales that human studies of human genetic diversity are premised upon and also at the same time producing. And I want to also pursue this engagement by addressing what I describe as the biopolitical geographies of difference and relatedness. That is, rather than deem these developments as either a simple return to racial science, or simply accept the claims made by population geneticists that these projects are anti-racist in their intentions and effects, I want to argue that it's more productive to consider the implications of this renewed emphasis on biogenetic inheritance, or shared biogenetic inheritance, through shared ancestry and origins, in popular and scientific accounts of human commonality, collective identities and difference. And here I want to focus on one popular account of new research on ancient ancestors, whose title I borrowed from my own. And I want to focus on it in itself, but also as a way of addressing the wider field, including some very recent developments in this context. So Blood of the Irish, Who Are the Irish and Where Do They Come From, was a two-part documentary screened on RTE in January 2009. It was a Crossing the Line production for RTE, and I expect many people here have seen it. It won the Best Documentary Award from the Irish Film and Television Awards in 2010. And this image and some others I'll show in a few moments is from a production notes publicity pack. It's also available as a DVD, and I'll show some stills from it later. The publicity material described as a series that seeks the truth about the Irish. So broadcaster David Gavin travels to the heart of Africa and beyond in a quest to find the very origins of the Irish people. Who are the Irish and whose blood flows in our veins? A landmark series for RTE1, Blood of the Irish explores the most fundamental questions about the Irish population. Who are the first people to settle here and where do they come from? And in the usual hype of advanced publicity, the series promised revelations. Blood of the Irish is a spectacular voyage of discovery. David Gavin travels to the birthplace of humankind in Africa and unveils extraordinary recent findings about our identity. The latest research on our DNA shows that, contrary to popular opinion, the Irish are not descended from the Celts. In fact, our true genetic origins date from the Stone Age, many thousands of years before the Celtic tribes emerged in Europe. It's suggested that the series reveals the very latest research on some hoary old chestnuts. How much Celtic blood really flows in this? Are the dark-eyed, dark-skinned inhabitants of the West of Ireland truly a legacy of roving Spanish armadas and wine merchants? It goes on to say, after almost 10,000 years of habitation on the cusp of the greatest transformation in our history, this series will reveal who exactly the Irish are. The series was structured around what's described as one symbolic family, a man, a woman and a child who undertake a 55,000-year journey out of Africa, crossing salt deserts, mountain ranges and glaciers before making the last leg to Ireland. And David Gavin has filmed on location at various points of this journey, looking at archaeological sites and material and talking to experts, archaeologists and geographers, and ordinary people and reflecting on what the science means. And even before considering the series and its science in more detail, these experts from the production notes already raise questions. Questions about the potency of linking ideas of blood and identity in phrases like, who are the Irish and whose blood flows in our veins? And this knowingly provocative question evokes a long and troubled history of the way that category Irish has been constituted, in part through ideas of native, ancient ancestry and rootiness, blood and soil, a popular ethno-nationalist origin story that sits awkwardly alongside efforts to reconfigure Irishness as a more inclusive collective, to counter the idealisation of native rootedness and national purity with metaphors of migrancy, mongrel mixing, and narratives of long histories of arrivals, cultural entanglements and exchange. There's the question of applying the modern category Irish to ancient people, and of the implications of this backwards extrapolation of nationhood for the grounds of belonging in Ireland today. So what sort of category of Irishness is produced with possessive pronoun "our" as in our ancestors, or our veins? If these ancestors are figures as ancient original people, and these veins, our veins, flow with their blood. So who is including these terms and on what basis? When Gavin talks of our ancestors, who is he interpolating into this contemporary collective of those of ancient and native descent? And these questions relate not only to issues of identity and belonging foregrounded by recent patterns of immigration, but also to the long-standing effects of nationalist models of native and natural roots and belonging in a community of shared ancient descent in Ireland, in Northern Ireland and in the diaspora. And these questions surface not just in relation to textual semantics, but through the documentary's words and images. One particular image stands out so far, and I think this image in the publicity notes was probably chosen to be striking because of its apparent contradiction with an expected image of Irish embodiment. And it features the actress in the documentary who plays a hunter-gatherer in the eastern Rift Valley of Africa 65,000 years ago. And perhaps it's meant to suggest an ancient collective African ancestry of all of humanity, a theme that runs through Blood of the Irish, as well as many other popular accounts of human population genetics and evolutionary history. Perhaps it works to challenge ideas of Irish whiteness. But if this is so, then it's considerably qualified by the symbolic style of the actress as ancient or traditionally African, rather than contemporary black and Irish. And we are, I suspect, meant to see as a very ancient ancestor of humanity's ancient homeland, but not as an Irish person today. And it's these questions of the genetic and genealogical figuring of the Irish and eugenetic accounts of ancient arrivals and departures that I want to explore a bit more. And firstly, I want to consider the way the series negotiates the relationship between discourses of rights and ethnic diversity that have emerged in response to recent immigration, and is focused on and figuring of first arrivals to Ireland as ancient ancestors and indigenous Irish. And then I'll consider in the second half of the paper the series of individual genetic ancestry tests and test results that feature in the documentary, as we're considering how themes of purity and mixing, rootedness and direct descent feature in popular culture and science of human genetic variation in Ireland. So firstly, to think about this notion of a diverse island and an ancient people. Blood of the Irish features the work of scientists in Trinity studying patterns of genetic variation in Ireland today in order to reconstruct ancient patterns of migration and settlement. They do so by comparing these contemporary patterns of genetic variation with those found elsewhere in Europe and in comparison to ancient genetic material found in human bones. And the work that is being done is part of the broader field of human population genetics, mapping patterns of human genetic variation and analysing those patterns in terms of geography and history of the spread of early humans and subsequent migrations of human groups. And it's the sort of work behind those accounts of the common African origins of all of humanity, or more specific claims of patterns of ancient settlement, are evidence of the genetics of a particular population, Viking ancestry in Iceland, for example. And this work is frequently presented in terms of its ability to address fundamental questions of human origins and as a tool for understanding relatedness, so ideas of who is related to whom and how, through its accounts of historical connections or distance between human groups of different kinds. And this focus on difference and distinctiveness is central to human population genetics, but it's often presented in terms of its contribution to a progressive image of shared humanity through its proof of the shared origins of all people in Africa, and thus as an enlightened anti-racist science. But there are, as I hope to show, still reasons to be concerned about the way studies of human genetic variation and elsewhere construct ideas of identity in terms of ancestry. So Blood of the Irish is concerned with the particular collective history of our ancient ancestors that figures a way of addressing identity. Who are the Irish? But like other popular and scientific accounts, it frames its focus both by featuring the narrative of shared human origins in Africa, and at least a degree of self-consciousness about the politics approaching the category of Irishness through the science of ancient ancestry and descent. So early on in episode 1, the scene shifts from an Irish shoreline. We're invited to imagine the footsteps of those first people who arrived in Ireland. It shifts from there to the eastern Rift Valley of Africa and the ancient homeland of all of humanity. And as David Gavin comments, your family may be from Dublin or Cork or Krakow, but that's our recent history. When we go way back, our DNA tells us that all of us are from here. And much of the documentary is devoted to presenting what's now a reasonably well-known account of the African origins of humanity, proven by genetic research, and the timing of the spread of people to other parts of the world as their survival in Africa was put under strain from changing climatic conditions. In Blood of the Irish, the focus is particularly on the spread of humans to Europe, the effects of the subsequent ice age and the survival of small numbers of human groups in the warmer conditions of northern Spain. And we see that family group in different times and places of this journey until they reach Ireland. So the idea of the ultimate shared origins of humanity prefigures the programme's focus on this more specific journey and more specific origins. Because between the genealogy and geography of immediate family locations like Dublin, Cork or Krakow and the origins of all of humanity in Africa, it's the scale of the national or ethnic identity, between the familial and the global. Human population genetics is thus inescapably entangled with popular and political discourses of collective similarity and difference, ideas of race, ethnicity or nation, that have been and in many ways continue to be imagined as genealogical categories, as communities of shared descent composed of people whose shared ancestry can be read through their bodily similarity. At one level, these ideas of bodily similarity and shared ancestry relate to the global geographical pattern of human physical variation. But the problem of racial thinking and ethno-nationalism is the drawing of boundaries within those gradients of difference, and in policing the supposed purity and natural exclusiveness of communities of shared descent, identity and belonging, the geographical rootedness of people in natural homelands. But human population genetics today is characterised by some degree of awareness of the tensions between its focus on human genetic difference and the politics of difference. In Blood of the Irish, its focus on human origins and Irish origins, is framed not only by this image of ultimate or deep sameness, but also by images of contemporary ethnic diversity in Ireland. And both episodes start with reference to a present population shaped by recent immigration and a positive statement of contemporary diversity. The opening is a narration that accompanies first aerial shots of Dublin city from the sea, then scenes of people walking along a busy O'Connell street is as follows. Never in history have the Irish been so varied. Our population today is a blend of many races, colours and creeds. But who were the very first people to set foot on this island? Up till now, all we could do was wonder about the origins of the first Irish, but the new science is beginning to resolve this age-old mystery. And there's a tension, I think, here between the programme's interest in that idea of the Irish people and their ancient ancestry, and the troubles by the politics of contemporary diversity, and the need to acknowledge obliquely at least the awkward question of the racial, or at least genealogical, exclusiveness of this model of the Irish people. A scene early on in the first episode is worth considering in a bit more detail. The scene shifts from where the greatest journey in human history began in Africa to a busy Dublin commuter train station. David Gavin is seen sitting in that busy train station, people watching. And the camera moves between him and the people coming through the station turnstiles. And Gavin expresses a familiar discourse of Irish embodiment of the look that we have. He says, when I'm sitting doing this outside the island, I can pick out an Irish person a mile away. And I always feel some sense of closeness with them, or belonging to that tribe. There's a look that we have. Now whether it's, red hair and freckles or light skin or blue eyes, it's definitely there, that makeup, that facial makeup. And while the narration continues, the camera focuses on a young man with Southeast Asian origins, a woman of Chinese origin, another with African origins, and Gavin's musings continue. He says, but the way we define our Irishness has always changed with the times. Of course there's more to identity than genetics, but ask people, particularly those living outside this island, they will often point to some family connection in the past that makes them Irish. And he pauses and continues. So I am Irish. I was born in London, but when I was a month old I was brought back to Dublin, and for the next 30 years I lived in Dublin, on the south side of Dublin. But am I really Irish? That's the thing about genetics. That will help me find out where I really come from, where I really belong. And a little later in the episode, we return to that scene, and he deposits a sample of saliva into a small container and sends it off with the genetic material contained in his cheek cells to be analysed as opposed to answers to this question of where he really belongs. And I just want to return to that scene again. I think this extract is particularly telling about what's at stake in the terms of genetics as a means to know yourself and your tribe, personal and collective identity, origins and relatedness. The potency of linking popular, and at one level at least, relatively benign, and in fact quite fluid and varied discourses of bodily types of our look, to a definition of Irishness and then one that is genetically sanctioned. The problem of this, for reinforcing an idea of Irishness as white, surfaces, I think, but it's quickly glossed over in the turn to another popular authority, this time not just to our look, but also to family connections that produce that look and make Irishness. Yet, the family connection doesn't seem strong enough. So David Gavin's story of birth and upbringing seems ground enough for his Irishness, but genetics is presented as offering some deeper truth. There's still a question for him. And he raises this issue of tension between the documentary's aim to reveal who exactly the Irish are, to its focus on ancient ancestors of most people in Ireland, and this image of an inclusive society not limited to those of native descent. I'm not implying that the contemporary politics of identity make it problematic studying ancient history of Ireland at all. I think there's much fascinating to many people about this new research and its combining of genetics and archaeology. And there's one level something commonsensical about thinking of Ireland until recently as predominantly white. But I think it's the linking of ideas of collective identity and heritage to ideas of native ancestry that's more problematic. Because that story of ancient settlement could be envisaged as part of the heritage of anyone on the island. But it's the figuring of that story is really and naturally only the story of those who have that ancient blood in their veins that produces a much more exclusive model of Irishness and Irish heritage. Implicitly exclusionary for those descended from early modern and contemporary arrivals to the island. And this problem of linking ideas of collective heritage to native ancestry also arises in a new project launched in October last year, the Irish DNA Atlas Project, a survey of genetic variation in the island as a whole, being undertaken in a collaboration between the Geological Society of Ireland and the Royal College of Surgeons. And as in other projects of this kind, those donating samples to the project must have been born in the area their family lived in, going back generations, going back in this case to their 8 great-grandparents. And this, in the study, defines as representative of the genetic character of the locality. In the popular reporting of this was converted to their being defined as typically Irish. The project is presented as producing a biomedical resource, but genetic variation in Ireland is also presented as a national resource for collective cultural heritage. The first project newsletter states that the diversity of the Irish genome is a valuable yet largely unexplored resource of the Irish nation. An island population on the edge of Europe, Ireland has a rich cultural heritage that is the product of ancient migrations from a neighbouring island and from mainland Europe. Understanding and preserving this history enriches our culture. In this case, the collective heritage is figured as the product of diverse ancient migrations. But the distinction it may produce is that between a native genetic diversity, so the diversity that's product of all those earlier migrations, and the patterns of new diversity in the present. And also implying a sort of a version of rich cultural heritage that's the natural property of those who also have that so-called native genetic ancestry. But at the same time, new genetic and archaeological accounts of studies which show that most people on the island descended from the very earliest settlers in the Stone Age rather than later Celtic settlers and that subsequent arrivals left very little impact on the gene pool, that feature in the documentary, tend to produce an image of an ancient and largely homogeneous population, in contrast to small numbers of non-native arrivals who cannot be thought of as genetically native. So in contrast to the idea of the mongrel nation, a place shaped by complex histories of migration to and from the island, it defines those with ancestry elsewhere as genetic erratics, out of place. And for human population geneticists, the contemporary arrival of the so-called non-native also appears as a threat to the knowledge of ancient Irish ancestors. In Blood of the Irish, and in similar documentaries which feature human population genetics, new patterns of mobility, immigration and mixing are at one level framed by celebrations of multicultural diversity, but are also deemed to be a problem for the science, since it is only unmixed populations that can be viewed as resources for studying ancient patterns of mobility. And so as one science in the documentary comments, there is so much movement and it's increasing more and more. We will be able to find out who the ancestors of the Irish are in the future. And he's not referring here to some kind of mass exodus of the Irish people, but to immigration, integration and intermarriage. Not to there being no one left to test, but fewer unmixed people to test. So we're encouraged to know that we all have African roots ultimately, but the more people who are born in Ireland with roots in Ireland and African or other countries, the less possible it will be to find out about the ancient Irish, according to the way they present these issues. So this is presented as a scientific rather than a social problem, but it does nevertheless evoke an anxiety about the effects of ethnic diversity in Ireland for collective self-knowledge via the new genetics. But ideas of mixing and purity, homogeneity and diversity are in fact entangled in human population genetics. For if the population of Ireland is presented as primarily of native ancient descent, it's also figured in terms of gradients of difference, as an internally differentiated geography of variation. Efforts to consider the degree of similarity between genetic variation in Ireland and other places as a means to reconstruct ancient migration pathways depends on studying genetic variation within Ireland. So studies of human genetic variation in Ireland do not simply reproduce an old racial language of distinct types. They are studies of genetic variation, not attempts to characterise a single type. Yet they do work with a language of distinctive genetic markers that are deemed to be Irish and described as Irish. And this is coupled, I think, with the reification of the idea of direct, unbroken descent. And it's these geographies of genetic ancestry that I want to turn to in the next section by talking through some of the tests that feature in the documentary itself. Like other popular accounts of the new science of studying genetic variation, Blood of the Irish includes 4 cases of individuals having their genetic material analysed in terms of what it might say about individuals' ancestry beyond the timescale of ordinary genealogy. And this trope of tests and test results and revelations is clearly meant to achieve dramatic effects as well as personalise the science. And in this section I want to focus on these 4 in turn, to consider what it says about the figuring of genetic accounts of ancestry as a source of personal and collective self-knowledge. So the first is to do with himself. So firstly, we've already seen David himself sending off his sample to genetic ancestry testing. This company, he sends it to a company called Ethno-Ancestry, whose scientists also undertake the analysis and deliver the results in the other 3 cases. And Ethno-Ancestry is one of the relatively recent additions to a number of genetic ancestry testing companies that have been developed over the past 10 years or so. And like the others, it's established by enterprising population geneticists who see the commercial potential of selling people tests whose results can be compared with databases of information on the geography of human genetic variation, patterns of variation associated with different parts of the world. So an individual is usually told of the scientific label of a particular distinctive form of genetic material that they carry and where this is predominantly found. And this is meant to suggest some kind of a connection to a place by an ancient lineage. They, as you probably know, particularly marketed to those who descend from enslaved people from Africa, in the UK and the US, and to those in North America, New Zealand and Australia, and other places pursuing geological research on their European ancestors. In Derek Gallen's case, he's told that his genetic material is most commonly found in the Alps of northern Italy and Switzerland, eastern England or eastern Scotland. it is, he is told, never seen in Ireland at all. In this case, it seems to correspond to his paternal great-great-grandfather from Aberdeen, the first of the Gavins in Ireland in his family history, so a relatively recent origin story. The genetic material analysed here, as in many other of these commercial tests, is his Y chromosome, which is inherited directly from father to sons, and is indicative of direct paternal descent. Most genetic tests focus on this genetic material, or mitochondrial DNA, that is maternally inherited. Unlike the analysis of mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome analysis singles out one lineage from the ever-branching nature of any family tree. So the entangled family histories within Ireland and within family histories that cross the Irish Sea and extend in wider geographies of lateness, and speak so much of that wider historical and cultural interconnections, and that have been used in Northern Ireland, for example, to challenge the ideas of neatly bounded groups of different descent. They simply cannot feature in these genetic studies because they work in terms of a single paternal or single line of maternal descent. And in this case, they highlight Scottish origins rather than encompass Diarmaid's Gavin's Irish and Scottish ancestry. In other cases, they might suggest singular genetic origins in Ireland and overlook other patterns of mixing. In a very immediate sense, they discount one side of family tree as genetically irrelevant, with all the implications this has for those suddenly deemed to be less significant relatives. So people who hugely matter in the practice of family or in personal senses of ancestral influence are simply often irrelevant in the genetic focus on direct paternal or maternal descent. And we'll see in a later case the problem of aligning this idea to native and non-native ancestry. So despite his early anticipation of answers from genetics, the questions of what the results mean for Diarmaid Gavin, the sense of Irishness, origins, and longing, is not pursued. We don't hear any discussion about his comments about being told that this type is never seen in Ireland at all. But perhaps it's not pursued, because if genetics is really deemed to define origins, identity and belonging, as this programme suggests, then his sense of Irishness is not matched by genetic roots in Ireland, but in Scotland, along this genetic patrilineage at least. And obviously there are lots of different ways of thinking about belonging identity, but in this case they're subordinated to a genetic and genealogical model. The second case is interesting. It reveals another sort of set of concerns and the nature of this culture and science. So if that first case serves to explain the nature of these tests, the second case is more directly linked to documentaries focused on the ancient ancestors of the Irish more broadly. In this case, a local man from County Galway, Pádraig MacDonagh, known as Tanti in the programme, is tested in one episode and told the results in the second episode. He is told, pure Gael. And the route to this man and his results in this documentary is via old anthropological studies of regional physical variation in Ireland. Popular mythologies of Spanish ancestry evident of the dark eyes and skin of the people along the west coast of Ireland, and recent genetic studies of variation. So Diarmaid Gavin's arrival in Clifton and search for people with the distinctive Connemara look as a way of pursuing the search for knowledge of ancient first people is preceded by his account and the programme's reconstruction of a scene from the Harvard Physical Anthropology of Ireland survey undertaken in the 1930s. As Gavin explains, the results of measuring the physical features of 8,000 men and 2,000 women and analysing the results county by country were that blue eyes and long-shaped heads are mostly found in the east, brown eyes and brown-shaped heads in the west, and most blondes and red heads in the Midlands. And this is presented in the programme as evidence of an east-west gradient that echoes strongly those early 20th century discourses of Western bodily and cultural purity and Eastern corruption. None of the Irish does acknowledges the ways which Ireland has been a laboratory for the study of human physical variation over the course of the 20th century, the studies of blood types and genetic markers, replacing measurements of hair colour, eye colour and head shape. Earlier studies of physical variation, early mythologies of ancient arrivals and popular discourses of difference are there to be tested by new genetic techniques in the blood of the Irish, as Gavin narrates. So on the eastern side of Ireland, we've ended up with a population that's more intermixed with waves and waves of people arriving over the centuries. It's the west coast you come to if you want to find the strongest evidence of the first of the Irish. That's the theory anyway. The racial studies like those in the 1930s have fallen out of fashion. But the idea persists that there is an east-west trend in our population, and actually most people will assure you that there are distinct physical characteristics to be found in different parts of the country. But is this really true, and what can it tell us about the original settlers of Ireland and where they may have come from? This reference to a popular discourse of regional difference is joined to a specific popular belief that many people in Connemara along the western seaboard have dark hair and dark skin, which reflects the influence of sailors from the ships of the Spanish Armada who survived at shipwrecks along the west coast of Ireland in the late 16th century. So Tanti, who is recruiting for the documentary's project, attributes his appearance and that of others like him to this Spanish inheritance. But this popular discourse of regional difference is also considered in the light of new genetic research. Later in the programme, we informed of the results of a genetic survey of the Y chromosome variation in Irishmen undertaken by Justice and Trinity and published in 2000. The research found a particular Y chromosome type that is very common in Ireland, but is found with a distinctive geography of variation, both in Europe in general and in Ireland itself. It's found to exhibit an east-west gradient that goes from lowest frequencies in the east and highest frequencies in the west of Europe, and is found in most concentration in the west of Ireland. And this is interpreted as evidence of an ancient genetic Irish type that survived in the west of Ireland, the region least affected by later settlement. It's also found in high concentrations in the Basque region of northern Spain, and this is also interpreted as evidence that the first settlers in Ireland, 10,000 years ago, arrived through migration up the western seaboard of Europe, that they descend from those humans who survived the Ice Age in northern Spain. So this is the programme's promised answer to that question of where the first arrivals came from. Another intervention, I think, into that long-standing tradition of debates about the nature and direction of ancient migration to the island that span archaeological scholarship and popular history, including the revival of biophonetics of the idea of an Irish North African or Atlantean origins. In Blood of the Irish, this is converted into proof of a specific ancient Basque-Irish connection. Tanti's results, he's told, suggest not a connection to Spain that stretches back a few centuries to the Armada, but thousands of centuries to the first arrivals. So this is the Genesis explanation of the dialogue that followed. The Genesis, Gianpiero Cavalieri, referred to as JP in the programme, announces the news. He says, Tanti, we've taken a look at your genes and we can tell that you've been around here for a lot more than a couple of 100 years. You're pure Gael, that's for sure. And Tanti says, is that a fact? I'm delighted to hear it. And JP carries on then. So you carry a type that we refer to as ancient Irish. It's obviously very much a characteristic of Ireland and seen for the most only in Ireland. That would not support a direct link to your genes to the Spanish Armada because your type is indigenous to Ireland and it predates the Spanish Armada. When you look back through the roots of this type, it has its origins in northern Spain. We can date it to that area around 20,000 years ago. So at that time, Ireland and the UK were all covered by ice, as was much of northern Europe and Spain. And Spain was one of the refuges where modern human populations were able to survive. As the ice started to recede away from northern Spain, away from Europe, people started to move in behind that ice and repopulate the islands, including Ireland. Your type can be traced back to Spain and the Basque country around 20,000 years ago. And the dialogue continues. So Tanti says, God, I don't know if there's a place in Ireland that can hold me now. Is this country big enough for it all? And David Gavin says, how does it feel to be one of the original Irish? And he responds, it's great to know where your roots are, where you are. This is where you originally stem from. And I suppose I carry that sense of place with me. And I'm delighted to hear that I'm indigenous to the area, and here is where I should be. Though Tanti's response begins with an expanded or even exploded sense of belonging, the final comment prompted by David Gavin's reference to the original Irish is a classic expression of the deep appeal of indigeneity. I'm indigenous to the area and here is where I should be. A death-size indigeneity in this case. But obviously definitions of the indigenous always depend on the definition of the non-indigenous. Thus the happy celebration of genetically proven linked to ancient first people needs to be considered in terms of definitions of not belonging, or degrees of belonging, and how genetic studies and their popular presentations are producing subtle, but nevertheless significant messages about who is native and non-native in Ireland. Excuse me, and these are the terms used in the studies themselves. Unsurprisingly, Blood of the Irish does not feature the critical responses to this genetic survey. The genetic survey is constitution of the native and non-native. And this related particularly to the way the studies defined native Irish descent in terms of a man having a Gaelic surname, and defined non-native ancestry through what described as names indicating Norse, English, Norman or Scottish ancestry. In the Y chromosome genetic survey that the programme drew on, a man having a Gaelic surname was said to be a direct male line descent from ancient Gaelic inhabitants and of having native ancestry. A man with a non-Gaelic name, Norse, Norman, English or Scottish or of origin, was judged to be of non-native direct male line ancestry, was genetically non-native. As critics argued, even if the geneticists are not linking this to contemporary ethnic identity, the language of native and non-native cannot not imply distinctions between people in terms of identity and belonging. This is especially the case when ideas of genetic ancestry are so strongly linked to ideas of ancestry by genetic testing companies and in the popular presentation of the research. Again, there's a sort of common sense logic here, but the focus on direct paternal descent discounts the entangled genealogies that upset these distinctions between the native and non-native, and this discounts the important challenges the ideas of pure Irishness based on Gaelic descent. So Tanti, in this case, gets to enjoy a definition of native belonging, but what does that imply for all those defined as genetically not native? The third example here, so if this has implications, what I've been saying so far has implications for ideas of belonging in Ireland, they also have implications for ideas of belonging within the Irish diaspora. So the third case is a test and a result that opens up this issue. The person to be tested in this case is Daniel O'Donnell, who is told that he is a direct descendant of Niall and Niall hostages, that 15th century Irish High King. And this, again, is the popular method of bringing to life another strand of the research method into college geneticists who interpret the high concentration of a particular Y chromosome type in the northwest of Ireland as a likely indication of the evidence that Niall's line hostages, as a powerful ruler, had many children and established an extensive male lineage. In Blood of the Irish, as in its wider popular reporting, as I've explored more elsewhere, this speculation about the connection is presented by the geneticists themselves as the truth of genetically verified lineage. Soon after the research was published in 2006, it became possible for men to buy a test from Family Tree DNA, which is one of the first and biggest genetic genealogy companies, to see if they too are direct descendants of Niall and Niall hostages. Family Tree DNA sell many tests to men in Irish Gaelic clan associations also, with members across the diaspora. And many clan associations are now using these tests to establish the Y chromosome genetic profile that corresponds to their clan lineage, and exploring the ancestral connections between the members. So this particular strand of this field doesn't feature in Blood of the Irish, but it's worth reflecting on briefly here, since the documentary is part of this wider intersection between science, culture, politics, identity, and belonging. Genetic clan studies, genetic Irish clan studies produce a particular version of authentic Irish diasporic identity. It's genetic. One thing, complex diasporic genealogies are reduced to direct descent lineages. It's also male. Women neither inherit nor pass on the Y chromosome types that are becoming associated with specific Gaelic clan names and are becoming proof of distinctive branches of Gaelic ancestry. It's also Gaelic. Non-Gaelic surnames are genetically defined as non-native. So non-Gaelic names and Y chromosome lineages are defined as having roots beyond Ireland. Thus, a man with a very strong sense of Irish ancestry, somewhere beyond Ireland in the diaspora, but without a Gaelic surname, is genetically defined as having ancestral roots elsewhere, even if he has Gaelic names in his family on his mother's side or his father's maternal side, and generations of family history in Ireland. Of course, clan associations don't hold a monopoly on the making of diasporic attachments, but the authority of science to into ideas of native and non-Gaelic does need to be reckoned with as it increasingly pervades the cultures of diasporic genealogy. The final case of genetic tests and test results involves children. Towards the end of Blood of the Irish, a group of local children near the borough, whose families are described as having a history in the area going back many generations, are tested to see if their genetic material matches that extracted from the bone of a child who died 3,500 years ago, and his remains have been found in a cave in the borough. A match, in this case, of mitochondrial DNA would suggest that the contemporary children have a direct maternal line descent from people living in the area, living in that area 3,500 years ago. So this part of the documentary, scientists Justice JP and Derek Gavin announced to a room of perhaps 20 children and their parents that 3 of the children, Aidan, Aoife and Anthony, have a special relationship with that distant child. And the stage here, I think, is another demonstration of the power of the new genetic technology and the magic of deep roots and ancestral connections. As Derek Gavin comments and reflecting on the result, as we learn to read its codes and secrets, DNA shows us just how deeply rooted we are to the Irish landscape. And I think this seems to be on the face of it, the most innocent and appealing example of the power of human population genetics. The cameras focus on the surprise and pleasure of the children as they are told that they have a special connection. The issue is, of course, again, the problem of making genetics the natural basis of deep-rootedness and the non-belonging of the genetically non-native. So to conclude, what I've been trying to foreground here is the need to critically engage with the increasing prominence of discourses that entwine ideas of ancestry, descent, origins, identity, and belonging in science and public culture. But there's not a simple target of critique. Blood of the Irish, like the science and popular culture of human genetic variation, is not malicious in intent, and it's not obviously pernicious in its effects. It's often presented as both naturally fascinating and as happily far from the bad science of race and eugenics. Human population genetics deploys a language of diversity as well as distinction, variation as well as homogeneity, migration as well as origins, and it does so at different scales. But I think there are still reasons to resist the entwining of identity and genetically defined ancestry and origins. So I want to end with some reflections on the documentary and the science and politics of linking identity, belonging, ancestry and genetics through the final words of the closing scene of the documentary. Against the backdrop of African grassland and then an Irish rocky landscape, Dermot Gavin narrates these closing lines. He says, "It's been an amazing journey finding out where we, the Irish, come from. I was fascinated at the start of this process because as an Irish person I wanted to know where did I come from? How did our people get to where they did? The big lesson that I've learned is yes, that it's important to know where I'm rooted, but all of a sudden the association with humanity, with people who came out of Africa, becomes very important too, maybe more important. The deeper we look into the past, the more options it presents. Our DNA is what makes us unique, and it gives us the means to explore our individual ancestry at many different levels. At one level, the most recent, you could prove that you are directly descended from the very first Irish, and that might be as far back as you want to go. But if you go back even farther, our DNA links us with every person of European descent, and way, way back, our ancestry showed everybody on this planet is in Africa. So when it comes to finding who you are based on your ancestry, well, your options are wide open. It really is a case of deciding who do you want to be, Irish, European or African, or maybe all three. I think this passage is a particularly rich example of the complex, conjoined and sometimes competing and also sometimes contradictory messages being propagated in human population genetics, applied to questions of origins and identity. At one level, this final message is one of options and possibilities. You can decide who you want to be from the choices on offer, in this case Irish, European, or African, or all three. Despite the reification of direct descent in the rest of the programme, a lineage doesn't come to an ancient full stop until it reaches Africa. A person can, it suggests, decide on a homeland and identity anywhere back along the route of ancient ancestral migration. This works against celebration of single unique identity and a singular sense of rootedness, and David Gavin's expression of a newfound association with humanity seems to lift the programme out of its obsession with ethnic or national distinctiveness. Yet this idea of choice, or deciding who you want to be, may figure identity as happily multiple and undetermined, but does through one fundamental assumption of the programme, and in much of the science and cultural genetic origins that it reflects, and that is that identity, who you are and where you belong, is fundamentally about ancestral descent, about genetic inheritance. At the same time, these choices mask the production of deep lack of choice. since within the logics of identity and belonging as a function of ancestry, the choice to be Irish or European is not open to all in Ireland, but only to those defined as genetically Irish. Irishness and identification with place, history, culture, language thus becomes a genetic category. All these identifications are only really authentic and natural if they are matched by the right genetic markers. Similarly, the choice to be seen as European is not open to all in Ireland, let alone the rest of Europe. Finally, while the idea of associating with all humanity might seem to offset this exclusiveness with its ideal of a happy, global human family, as the programme itself suggests, this sense of humanity's shared ancestry is simply too general, too universal, too undifferentiated to displace the emphasis on the particular, distinctive lines of descent, origins, and categories of shared descent that are presented as being so compelling and so potent. So in these accounts, we are encouraged to identify with specific ancient ancestors and with those who share ancestry. But the other side of this idea of natural bonds through genetic similarity is the idea of the unnaturalness of bonds or affection or empathy between those who are genetically dissimilar with those whose genetic profiles reflect their ancestry elsewhere. So what does this suggest for social life, relationships and ideas of difference and belonging in diverse societies like Ireland and other places? Blood of the Irish gestures towards other models of Irishness and other modes of identification, but I think it is ultimately an audio-visual hymn to an ancient pure ancestry of unbroken images that stretch back to ancient First Peoples. Even if these First Peoples are themselves figured as having roots and relations elsewhere and African origins ultimately, Blood of the Irish is a celebration of an ideal geography of belonging, in which where you live is where your ancient ancestors lived, and whose proof is now literally in the blood in your veins. Thank you.